The wind howling through the Caribou Mountains did not sound like moving air. It sounded like tearing metal. Inside the drafty single-room cabin, the temperature was plummeting toward a lethal 40 below zero. In the center of the room, a cast-iron stove sat rapidly cooling, its belly empty, save for a few dying embers of birch. Stacked against the far wall was 5 tons of what the locals had laughingly called swamp sponge, a cheap, damp, muddy timber that had stubbornly refused to catch fire all winter. They had been told they were fools. They had been told they would freeze to death clutching useless logs. But as the last of their good firewood turned to gray ash, necessity forced their hands toward the rejected pile, leading to a discovery that defied everything they knew about survival. The very thing meant to kill them had quietly transformed into their only salvation. Silas Abernathy wiped a streak of muddy sweat from his forehead, leaning heavily against the rusted tailgate of his 1984 Ford pickup, his breath plumed in the crisp, late October air. Beside him stood Audrey, her arms crossed tightly over her insulated flannel jacket, staring at the colossal pile of dark, strange-looking timber they had just spent 4 hours unloading. They had poured the last of their savings, $14,000, into this remote 3-acre plot in the deep backcountry of British Columbia. It was a desperate bid for a new start after the collapse of Silas's contracting business in Seattle. The land came with a sturdy, if weathered, log cabin, a freshwater spring, and the terrifying reality of complete isolation. The nearest town, a sparse collection of buildings known as Pine Ridge, was 40 miles down a logging road that would soon become impassable. Their most pressing concern upon arrival had been fuel. The previous owner had left the woodshed entirely bare, and harvesting enough dry, seasoned wood from the surrounding forest to last an 8-month winter was an impossible task for 2 people arriving so late in the season. That was when they met Gideon Price. Gideon was a local broker of sorts, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He operated out of a dilapidated hardware store in Pine Ridge, selling everything from chainsaw chains to bulk kerosene. When Silas had asked about buying firewood, Gideon had immediately offered them a salvage lot of timber from a recently drained valley bog. 30 cords, Gideon had said, leaning over his counter and lowering his voice conspiratorially. Logging company pulled it up when they were dredging the lower basin. It's heavy, it ain't pretty, and the locals won't touch it because it doesn't look like good clean pine. But it's wood. I'll let you have the whole lot, delivered to your property line, for $300. $300 for 30 cords of wood was not just a steal, it was practically free. Standard seasoned birch or fir would have cost them over $3,000, money they simply did not have. Desperate and relieved, Silas had shaken Gideon's hand. Now, staring at the massive, sprawling heap of dark, earth-caked logs sitting in their yard, the reality of their purchase was setting in. The wood was completely unlike anything Silas had ever handled. It was incredibly dense, wet, and covered in a thick layer of grayish-brown silt. When he tried to split a medium-sized log with his maul, the axe head didn't bite into the wood with a satisfying crack. Instead, it buried itself with a dull, wet thud, getting stuck so firmly in the spongy, fibrous interior that Silas had to wrestle with it for 10 minutes to free the blade. The logs smelled faintly of sulfur, deep earth, and ancient decay. "It's so ugly," Audrey murmured, kicking a smaller piece with the toe of her boot. The wood didn't move. It felt like kicking a sack of wet concrete. "Ugly burns just as hot as pretty," Silas replied, though his voice lacked conviction. He bent down and picked up a piece the size of a loaf of bread. It weighed at least 20 pounds. "It's just waterlogged. We stack it, let the wind hit it, and keep a good rotation near the stove to dry it out before we burn it." They spent the next week engaged in back-breaking labor, moving the 30 cords of swamp timber from the drop point into the large, open-air woodshed beside the cabin. Every evening, their muscles screamed, their hands were blistered, and their clothes were stained with a stubborn, greasy black mud that refused to wash out. On their final supply run to Pine Ridge before the first snows were predicted to fall, they bumped into Tobias Blake. Tobias was a fixture of the area, an old-school trapper who had lived in the Caribou Mountains for 50 years. He was loading bags of flour into his truck when he spotted Silas and Audrey. "Here you folks bought Gideon's mud pile," Tobias called out, his voice rough as coarse sandpaper. He didn't smile. Silas walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. We bought the salvage timber, yeah. It's wet, but we're stacking it to dry. Tobias stopped what he was doing and looked at Silas with a mixture of pity and irritation. Son, that ain't timber. That's bog rot. Gideon's been trying to pawn that garbage off for 2 years. The logging company dug it out of a compressed peat marsh. It's half-rotted, water-choked root systems and silt. You can't split it, and you sure as hell can't burn it. You put a match to that, it'll just hiss at you and smoke you out of your own house. Audrey stepped forward, a knot of panic tightening in her chest. But it has to burn. It's wood. A soaked sponge is made of cellulose too, little lady. But you don't see me throwing it in my fireplace, Tobias said grimly. You folks need to go buy some real firewood. Beg, borrow, or steal the money. Because when the deep freeze hits in January, that mud pile won't do a damn thing to keep your blood pumping. Silas felt a flush of anger and embarrassment, but he forced a tight smile. We'll manage. We have a few cords of dry pine we felled ourselves to start the fires. The bogwood will dry. Tobias shook his head, slamming his tailgate shut. The caribou don't care about your optimism, boy. They call that stuff dead stone timber. You bought yourselves a monument, not firewood. Don't say nobody warned you. As Tobias drove away, Silas and Audrey stood in the freezing mud of the parking lot, a heavy, silent dread settling over them. They had $300 left to their names. There was no buying seasoned wood. They were entirely, inescapably committed to the swamp timber. They drove back to the cabin in silence. That night, as the first light dusting of snow began to fall, coating the massive, ugly stacks of dark wood in pristine white, Silas brought a few pieces inside. He placed them directly next to the cast-iron stove, hoping the radiant heat from their small supply of dry pine would bake the moisture out of Gideon's cursed logs. It'll be fine, Silas whispered to Audrey in the dark, pulling the heavy wool blankets up to their chins. We'll make it work. But as the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, he couldn't shake the echo of Tobias's warning. You bought yourselves a monument. November arrived not with a gentle transition, but with the violent slam of a heavy door. The temperature plummeted to 10 degrees below zero and refused to climb back up. The logging road connecting them to Pine Ridge was buried under 4 feet of snow by Thanksgiving, effectively sealing Silas and Audrey in their 3-acre world. At first, the survival routine kept the panic at bay. They had managed to scrounge and chop about 2 cords of decent, dry pine and birch from the deadfall around their property. They husbanded this good wood like gold, burning just enough to keep the cabin hovering around a brisk 50 degrees. They wore thermal layers indoors, drank endless cups of hot tea, and tried to ignore the looming, dark presence of the swamp timber stacked outside. But the real test came in mid-December. A weather system the radio announcers grimly referred to as a polar vortex stalled directly over the mountain range. The ambient temperature dropped to 25 below zero. The wind chill pushed it past -40. The cold became an aggressive physical presence. It seeped through the chinking in the logs, forming thick layers of white frost on the inside of the cabin walls. A glass of water left on the kitchen counter overnight froze solid by morning. To combat the lethal cold, Silas had to feed the stove constantly. The good pine, which burned hot and fast, was vanishing at a terrifying rate. By Christmas Day, they were down to their last half-cord of dry wood. We have to try the swamp timber, Audrey said, her voice muffled by the thick scarf she wore indoors. Her breath was visible in the center of the room. We can't keep burning the pine. It'll be gone in a week. Silas nodded grimly. Over the past month, they had kept a rotating supply of the dark, heavy bogwood stacked directly against the brick hearth, rotating the pieces every few days, hoping the ambient heat of the stove would dry them out. He selected a medium-sized chunk of the bogwood. It was still shockingly heavy, but the greasy mud on the outside had baked into a dusty, dry crust. He opened the door of the cast-iron stove. Inside, a robust bed of glowing orange pine coals radiated intense heat. Taking a deep breath, Silas tossed the swamp timber directly onto the coals and shut the heavy iron door. They sat in front of the stove, watching through the small glass viewing pane, waiting. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. The black lump just sat there, suffocating the coals beneath it. Then, A thick, acrid, yellowish smoke began to billow from the wood. It didn't catch fire. It merely simmered, hissing like a punctured tire. The smoke was so dense it began to backdraft down the chimney, leaking through the seals of the stove door. Within moments, the cabin filled with a foul, sulfurous stench that smelled of rotting leaves and burning plastic. Audrey broke into a violent coughing fit, her eyes watering. "Open the door! Open the door!" she choked out, rushing to the front door of the cabin and throwing it wide. A blast of agonizingly cold air rushed in, sweeping the smoke out but instantly dropping the cabin's temperature by 20 degrees. Silas grabbed a pair of thick leather welding gloves, yanked the stove door open, and reached into the searing heat. He grabbed the smoking, hissing lump of bogwood and threw it out the front door into the snow, where it hissed violently, melting a deep black hole in the white drift before finally dying out. He slammed the cabin door shut and leaned against it, his chest heaving. The cabin was freezing again. The fire in the stove had been smothered, the coals reduced to dull, dying red specks. "Tobias was right," Silas whispered, staring at his gloved hands. "It doesn't burn. It just suffocates the fire." Despair, cold and sharp, settled into their bones. They spent the next hour meticulously rebuilding the pine fire, watching their precious reserve shrink even further. January brought no relief. The vortex held them in a merciless grip. The world outside the cabin was a blinding, howling white void. The sun, when it appeared, was a pale, heatless disk in a sky the color of bruised iron. By the second week of January, they were rationing the pine to a dangerous degree. They let the fire die down to a mere flicker during the day, huddling together under a mountain of sleeping bags and wool blankets on the floor right next to the hearth. They only stoked the fire at night to prevent freezing to death in their sleep. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical. The constant, gnawing cold made every movement agonizing. Their joints ached. Their skin was cracked and bleeding. They ate canned beans cold, saving the stove's heat entirely for warming the room. Silas found himself staring at the remaining logs of pine. 10 logs, 8 logs, 6 logs. He looked at the towering stacks of bogwood outside the frost-rimed window. 5 tons of fuel, utterly useless. It was a cruel joke. They were going to freeze to death, next to the largest pile of wood in the county. "What happens when the pine is gone?" Audrey asked one evening. Her voice was thin, fragile. She had lost weight, her cheekbones sharp and pronounced in the flickering firelight. "We'll break down the furniture," Silas said, avoiding her eyes. "The kitchen table, the chairs, the bed frame. And after that?" Silas didn't answer. He didn't have to. The cabin walls seemed to press in on them, the cold acting like a physical vice, tightening with every passing hour. On January 18th, the thermometer on the porch hit 45 below zero. The wind shrieked with a demonic intensity, shaking the heavy log walls of the cabin. Inside, Silas placed their very last piece of dry pine into the stove. He closed the iron door with a soft, final clank. They sat on the floor, wrapped in their blankets, watching the flames consume their final lifeline. The fire would last perhaps 2 hours. The coals might give off heat for another 2. By dawn, the interior of the cabin would drop below zero. They would not survive another day without heat. Silas pulled Audrey close, burying his face in her hair. The silence between them was heavy with the unspoken realization that they were out of options. The fool's bargain had finally caught up to them. The fire died slowly, a desperate, fading heartbeat in the center of the freezing room. By 3 a.m., the flames were entirely gone, leaving only a bed of deep red embers. The cold immediately began to reclaim the space. Silas could see his breath illuminated by the faint crimson glow of the stove. His hands and feet were numb, a dangerous, heavy lethargy creeping into his muscles. This was the onset of hypothermia, the body slowly shutting down its extremities to protect the core, an evolutionary surrender to the ice. He needed to do something. Anything. Breaking the furniture was the next logical step, but the thought of expending the energy to smash the heavy oak table seemed impossible. He unpeeled himself from the cocoon of blankets. Audrey stirred, murmuring something incoherent, her lips blue. Silas crawled toward the hearth. Lining the brick wall behind the stove were dozens of pieces of the swamp timber. He had brought them inside months ago, stacking them there in a futile, stubborn hope that the ambient heat would cure them. Over the brutal winter, as they huddled near the stove, he had completely ignored them. They were just part of the scenery now, a mocking reminder of his failure. He reached out and grabbed one of the pieces to toss it aside so he could get closer to the residual warmth of the bricks. As his hand closed around the chunk of bogwood, he paused. It felt wrong. When they had unloaded this wood in October, it was spongy, damp, and yielded slightly to pressure, like incredibly dense, wet cardboard. Now, as Silas gripped it, the texture was completely alien. It didn't feel like wood at all. He pulled it toward him. It was still incredibly heavy, but the surface was rock hard. He knocked his knuckles against it. It didn't produce the hollow thwack of dried timber. It produced a sharp, solid clink. Silas frowned, his cold-addled brain struggling to process the sensory information. He picked up his steel fire poker and tapped the tip against the dark mass. Clink, clink, clink. It sounded like he was hitting a piece of slate. He dragged the chunk closer to the dying light of the embers. The exterior, once coated in greasy mud, had baked and cured into a smooth, black, almost glossy surface. It looked like a chunk of unpolished obsidian or a heavy piece of asphalt. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable curiosity, Silas picked up a small hand hatchet that lay by the kindling bucket. He swung it down onto the edge of the strange, dark block. Sparks flew. Silas gasped, dropping the hatchet. The blade had not bitten into the material. It had glanced off, chipping away a small, sharp flake of the substance. He stared at the flake, resting on the hearth. It wasn't wood. It was impossible. Wood didn't turn to stone in 3 months. But as he stared at the dense, black, glassy interior, exposed by the chipped edge, a fragmented memory from a high school earth science class bubbled up through the fog of exhaustion and cold. Peat bogs, millions of years of pressure, carbonization. Gideon had said this timber came from a deep, dredged valley bog. Tobias had called it compressed peat and root systems. What Silas had bought wasn't simply waterlogged wood. It was an ancient, dense matrix of carbonized organic matter. It was the evolutionary bridge between a decaying swamp and a coal seam. It was lignite, brown coal. When it was wet and freshly dredged, it was a useless, non-combustible sponge filled with water and non-flammable gases. That was why it had hissed and smoked violently when he threw a raw piece on the fire in December. But these pieces had been sitting directly against the brick backing of a blazing cast-iron stove for 3 solid months in an environment with 0% humidity. The intense, sustained, radiant heat hadn't just dried the moisture out. It had baked and compressed the carbon structures. The wood hadn't turned to stone magically. It had undergone an accelerated, localized curing process, transforming into highly dense, rock-hard briquettes of nearly pure carbon. Silas's heart began to hammer against his ribs. "Audrey," he croaked, his voice cracking. "Audrey, wake up." She didn't move. Panic spiked in Silas's chest. He shook her shoulder violently. "Audrey, look at me." Her eyelids fluttered, and she looked at him with glassy, unfocused eyes. "So cold, Si. Just want to sleep." "No sleeping. Look." He shoved the heavy, stone-like block toward her face. "It's not wood. It's coal. It's compressed carbon." She didn't understand. She just closed her eyes again. Silas knew he had a terrifyingly short window. Lignite, especially in this dense, stone-like state, required immense heat to ignite. A regular match or a wadded-up piece of newspaper wouldn't even scorch it. He needed a catalyst, and the embers in the stove were dying fast. He lunged for the kitchen area, his frozen feet stumbling over the floorboards. He tore open the cupboards, his frantic hands knocking over cans of beans and stale crackers. He found what he was looking for, a half-empty plastic bottle of cooking oil. He rushed back to the hearth. He grabbed the hand hatchet, and using the blunt back of the heavy iron stove, he violently smashed the stone-like block of lignite into smaller, jagged, fist-sized chunks. It took massive effort, the material resisting the blows like river rock. He opened the stove door. The embers were a dull cherry red. He carefully arranged the jagged black stones directly over the hottest part of the ember bed. Then, he unscrewed the cap of the cooking oil and poured a liberal amount directly over the black chunks. He grabbed a piece of junk mail from the table, struck a match with trembling fingers, and lit the paper. He threw the flaming paper into the stove and slammed the door shut, leaving the bottom draft vent wide open to feed it oxygen. The cooking oil caught immediately, burning with a bright, smoky yellow flame. Silas knelt in front of the glass pane, his hands pressed against the cold floor, praying to whatever gods governed the freezing mountains. Burn. Please, God, let it burn. For 10 excruciating minutes, the oil burned, bathing the black stones in fire. But as the oil began to burn off, the flames died down. Silas's heart sank. It wasn't enough. The stones were too dense. They needed more heat to breach their ignition threshold. The yellow flames flickered, sputtered, and died. The stove went dark again. Silas let out a jagged sob, his head drooping. He had been wrong. It was just useless, baked mud. They were going to die. He crawled back over to Audrey, pulling her limp body into his arms, preparing for the end. 10 minutes passed in silent, freezing darkness. Then, a sound cut through the howl of the wind outside. Tick. Tick. Pop. Silas opened his eyes. He looked toward the stove. Through the glass pane, a strange light was growing. It wasn't the flickering yellow or orange of burning wood. It was a deep, steady, pulsing crimson. He scrambled back to the stove and stared through the glass. The jagged chunks of black stone hadn't gone out. The oil fire had just been the primer. Deep within the dense, carbonized structure of the lignite, the immense heat had finally taken hold. The edges of the black stones were glowing, not with flame but with raw, radiating incandescence. As oxygen rushed in through the bottom draft, the crimson glow spread across the surface of the stones, crawling over the jagged edges like liquid light. Then, the color began to shift. The deep crimson brightened to a brilliant cherry red, and then, astonishingly, to a blinding, furious white-hot orange. There were no flames. There was no smoke. There was only the terrifying, awe-inspiring glow of pure carbon reacting with oxygen. And then, the heat hit him. It didn't radiate gently like a pine fire. It punched through the cast-iron walls of the stove and the thick glass pane like a physical wave. It was an aggressive, blistering wall of thermal energy that instantly chased the chill from the air surrounding the hearth. Silas had to physically back away from the stove, throwing an arm up to shield his face. The heat was immense, hotter than any wood fire he had ever built. The cast iron of the stove began to ping and creak, expanding under the extreme temperature. He grabbed another large chunk of the cured, stone-like bogwood from the hearth. He opened the stove door, shielding his face from the blast furnace inside, and threw the heavy block directly onto the white-hot bed. He slammed the door shut. Within minutes, the new block began to glow, absorbing the heat and amplifying it. The cabin temperature, which had been plummeting toward zero, arrested its fall. Then, slowly, miraculously, the thermometer needle began to climb. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. Silas stripped off his heavy gloves and unzipped his thick coat. He crawled over to Audrey and pulled the heavy blankets off her face. "Audrey," he said, tears of absolute relief streaming down his face, freezing on his cheeks before melting again in the rising heat. "Audrey, feel it. Wake up and feel it." She opened her eyes, blinking against the bright, white-orange light filling the room. She took a breath, and the air she inhaled was no longer sharp and painful. It was thick, heavy, and wonderfully warm. "The fire," she whispered, staring at the stove, which was now radiating so much heat. The metal itself seemed to be humming. "The pine is gone. What is burning?" Silas looked at the remaining chunks of hardened, petrified-like bogwood lining the hearth. He thought of Gideon Price's scam, of Tobias Blake's mockery, of the 5 tons of useless mudwood buried under the snow outside. He let out a laugh that bordered on manic. "We are," Silas said, wiping his face. "We're burning the monument." The heat was absolute, almost oppressive in its intensity. By dawn, the interior of the cabin had skyrocketed from a lethal, bone-chilling freeze to a sweltering 85 degrees. Silas and Audrey had stripped down to their base layers, their faces flushed, a sheen of sweat coating their foreheads. In the center of the room, the heavy iron Fisher Papa Bear stove, a vintage, unyielding beast of a heater that had come with the cabin, was performing a miracle. Its matte black surface was pinging and ticking rhythmically as the metal expanded under the ferocious thermal load. Inside, the jagged chunks of hardened bogwood were not burning with dancing flames, but radiating a blinding, furious, white-hot incandescence. It was the sustained, relentless heat of a blacksmith's forge. Audrey sat back on her heels, wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. She stared at the small glass viewing pane, mesmerized by the blinding core. "It's actually working," she whispered, her voice still raspy from the smoke inhalation of their earlier failed attempts. "It's practically cooking us out of here." Silas didn't smile. He was staring past the stove, out the frost-thickened window toward the massive, snow-covered mounds in the yard. "It's working for now," Silas said, his voice tight with a new dawning anxiety. "But look at what we're burning." He pointed to the brick hearth. They had burned through 5 of the cured stone-like blocks of lignite to achieve this heat. There were perhaps 20 pieces left lining the wall, the pieces Silas had brought inside months ago and stubbornly left near the stove. Those pieces cured because they sat next to the fire for 90 days in 0 humidity. Silas explained, standing up and stretching his aching back. The immense radiant heat baked the moisture out and compressed the carbon, but the rest of it, he gestured toward the window. "Out there we have 5 tons of it, and right now it's not just wet mudwood. At 40 below zero, it's a frozen solid block of ice and swamp silt." Audrey's brief elation vanished, replaced by the cold, hard mathematics of their survival. The 20 pieces inside would buy them perhaps 3 days of heat. If they threw a frozen raw log from outside directly into the stove, it would simply melt, hiss, and extinguish the white-hot coals, plunging them back into the deadly freeze. "We have to dry it," Audrey said, standing up and looking around the small, single-room cabin. "We have to force-cure it. Fast." Thus began the agonizing, back-breaking era of the kiln. They could no longer use the cabin simply as a shelter. It had to become a functioning, high-temperature drying facility. Silas bundled up in his heavy canvas coat and waded out into the howling, chest-deep snowdrifts. Using a heavy steel pry bar, he had to physically chisel the frozen logs of bogwood free from the ice encasing the stacks. Every log weighed upwards of 30 pounds, heavy with frozen marsh water and densely packed silt. Silas hauled them in, 3 at a time, his muscles screaming against the freezing wind. Inside, Audrey orchestrated the curing line. They laid down heavy plastic tarps across the wooden floorboards. The first stage was the thaw. They stacked the frozen, mud-caked logs in a wide ring about 5 feet from the blazing stove. Within hours, the cabin transformed into a humid, foul-smelling swamp. As the extreme heat hit the frozen logs, the ice melted, turning the gray silt into a thick, greasy black mud that dripped onto the tarps in foul puddles. The air filled with the pungent, sulfurous odor of ancient, decaying vegetation, the smell of a prehistoric marsh resurrecting in their living room. "Keep rotating them," Silas shouted over the roar of the draft vent, his t-shirt plastered to his chest with sweat. Audrey, wearing heavy leather work gloves, manually rolled the heavy, dripping logs closer to the stove, moving the driest ones to the inner circle, right up against the hot brick of the hearth. It was a delicate, dangerous alchemy. If they moved a log too close, while it was still wet, it would steam violently, filling the room with an acrid, choking humidity that made it difficult to breathe. If they left it too far away, it wouldn't cure fast enough to replace the fuel they were burning. They worked in shifts, sleeping in 2-hour increments. The psychological toll of the freezing cold had been replaced by the grueling, physical exhaustion of industrial labor. Their hands were stained permanently black with coal dust and peat mud. The cabin walls were streaked with condensation. But as the 3rd day dawned, Silas picked up a log from the innermost circle, one that had spent 72 hours baking in the ferocious ambient heat of the Fisher stove. He tapped it with a fire poker. Clink. It didn't sound like a hollow, dried piece of pine. It sounded like slate. The exterior mud had baked into a hard, dusty crust, and the interior had compressed into the heavy, dense, black rock they so desperately needed. Silas looked at Audrey, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He raised the hand hatchet, swung it down, and chipped a black, glassy flake off the edge of the newly cured block. "We have a system," Silas breathed, a ragged, genuine smile breaking across his exhausted face. "We're manufacturing our own coal." By the second week of February, the weather showed no signs of breaking. The local radio broadcasts, crackling with static, spoke of the Great Arctic Outbreak, a stalled high-pressure system that had paralyzed the entire Pacific Northwest and the interior of British Columbia. Highways were closed indefinitely. Power grids in larger towns were failing. But inside the Abernathy cabin, the temperature held steady at an unbelievable 80 degrees. The curing rotation had become second nature. The outer ring thawed, the middle ring dried, and the inner ring petrified. However, they were about to learn that taming an ancient high-energy fuel source came with its own terrifying set of perils. Lignite, while incredible for its longevity and heat output, was not meant for residential wood stoves. It happened on a Tuesday night. The wind was shrieking against the eastern wall of the cabin, threatening to tear the cedar shingles from the roof. Silas, seeking to combat the aggressive draft, had loaded 3 large, fully cured chunks of the black stone into the stove and opened the bottom oxygen damper to maximum. Exhausted, he and Audrey had collapsed onto their mattress, falling into a deep, heavy sleep. Silas awoke violently a few hours later, choking. The air in the cabin was impossibly thick, completely devoid of moisture, and hot enough to sear his nasal passages. He threw off the thin sheet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin was bathed in a terrifying, unnatural crimson light. He looked toward the stove and froze in absolute horror. The Fisher Papa Bear was not just radiating heat, it was visibly failing under the immense thermal stress. The thick, cast-iron walls of the stove were glowing a dull, translucent red, like a horseshoe left too long in a blacksmith's forge. But that wasn't the worst part. Silas's eyes tracked upward. The heavy steel chimney pipe, which ran 8 feet vertically from the top of the stove through the wooden ceiling, was glowing a brilliant, terrifying cherry red. The intense, unthrottled heat from the pure carbon fire had ignited the creosote buildup from their earlier months of burning pine, creating a raging chimney fire that was drawing oxygen like a jet engine. "Audrey!" Silas roared, scrambling out of bed. "Get up! Now!" She bolted upright, coughing instantly as the superheated air hit her lungs. What is it?" "The pipe! It's overfiring." The wood paneling on the ceiling immediately surrounding the chimney pipe was beginning to smoke, the paint blistering and curling outward. If the wood caught fire, the entire cabin would be engulfed in minutes. In 40 below weather, losing the cabin meant freezing to death in the snow before dawn. Silas grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the floor. "Get water. Anything." Audrey rushed to the kitchen counter, grabbing the large metal pot they used to melt snow for drinking water. Silas didn't dare throw water directly onto the glowing cast-iron stove. The rapid temperature change would cause the metal to shatter like glass, sending white-hot coals exploding across the room. He had to choke the fire. He grabbed his heavy leather welding gloves, wincing as he approached the blazing forge. The radiant heat was blistering his exposed forearms. He kicked the bottom oxygen damper completely shut, cutting off the primary airflow to the roaring lignite. But it wasn't enough. The chimney fire was pulling oxygen through the tiny, imperfect seals of the stove doors. The pipe continued to glow a furious, demonic red. "The ceiling is smoking!" Audrey screamed, throwing a cup of water at the blistering wood above. It hit the glowing pipe and instantly vaporized into a cloud of scalding steam. Silas remembered a passage from an old, battered wilderness survival book he had read, a memoir detailing the harsh winters documented by John McCune, the great Canadian surveyor. When a stove runs away, you must kill the draft at its source. "The chimney cap," Silas yelled over the roar of the fire. "I have to block the top." He didn't bother putting on his coat. He grabbed the wooden stepladder, threw open the front door of the cabin, and plunged into the -40-degree hurricane outside, wearing nothing but his sweat-soaked t-shirt and jeans. The cold hit him like a physical blow, instantly freezing the sweat on his skin. He dragged the ladder to the side of the cabin, the snow up to his waist. Above him, a 3-foot jet of blue and orange flame was rocketing out of the metal chimney cap into the dark sky. He scrambled up the ladder, his bare hands sticking painfully to the freezing aluminum rungs. He reached the snow-covered eave of the roof. He couldn't reach the cap. Desperate, Silas scooped up massive, double armfuls of dense, packed snow from the roof's edge. He leaned over dangerously, ignoring the screaming pain in his frozen fingers, and began hurling the snowballs directly at the flaming chimney cap. The first two missed, swallowed by the wind. The third struck the metal pipe right below the cap, hissing violently. Silas threw another, and another, packing the wet, freezing snow against the side of the exposed pipe, cooling the exterior metal, fighting the internal fire with the sheer, brutal cold of the caribou winter. He grabbed a massive sheet of solid ice that had formed near the gutter and hurled it directly onto the top of the chimney cap, partially blocking the exhaust. Instantly, the roar of the jet engine draft faltered. The massive intake of oxygen was choked off. Silas clung to the ladder, his body convulsing with violent, uncontrollable shivers. He couldn't feel his feet. His hands were numb, blocks of wood. He waited 10 agonizing seconds. The jet of flame from the top of the pipe sputtered, choked on the trapped smoke, and died. He practically fell down the ladder, collapsing into the waist-deep snow. He crawled back to the open front door, dragging himself over the threshold. Audrey slammed the door behind him and dropped to the floor, wrapping him in the heavy wool blanket. Silas looked up, his teeth chattering so hard they sounded like a jackhammer. The Fisher stove was still pinging loudly, but the terrifying glow of the cast iron was fading back to matte black. The chimney pipe had cooled from cherry red to a dull bruised purple. The smoking wood on the ceiling had ceased to blister. They had survived. "We respect the stone," Silas gasped, pulling Audrey tightly against him, burying his freezing face in her shoulder. "We never, ever, leave the draft open again. We respect the stone." It was a brutal lesson in the alchemy of their survival. They had harnessed the power of the ancient earth, but it was a power that demanded absolute vigilance. From that night on, the stove was operated with militant precision, the lignite treated not as wood, but as a concentrated, highly volatile energy source. The deep freeze held its ground through the agonizingly slow crawl of February. The landscape around the cabin was a monochromatic wasteland of white snow and black skeletal trees. The silence of the isolation was total, broken only by the howling wind and the rhythmic, comforting ping of the cast-iron stove. Silas and Audrey had fallen into a steady, unyielding rhythm. The kiln was fully operational, producing a constant supply of hard, cured lignite blocks. They had mastered the draft of the stove, keeping the cabin at a steady, comfortable 70 degrees without risking another overfire. They were tired, dirty, and rationing their canned food, but they were no longer afraid of the cold. They had conquered it. On the morning of February 18th, the wind finally died down. The sky, for the first time in 6 weeks, broke into a brilliant, piercing blue. The temperature rose to a balmy 10 degrees below zero. Audrey was at the window, scraping a thin layer of frost from the glass with a spatula when she stopped. "Silas," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Listen." Silas looked up from where he was rotating a muddy log on the tarp. He held his breath. Through the thick log walls, a sound penetrated the absolute silence of the wilderness. It was mechanical, a high-pitched, two-stroke whine that grew steadily louder, echoing off the valley walls. A snowmobile. Silas dropped the log and joined Audrey at the window. A plume of white snow was kicking up on the edge of the tree line, right where their buried driveway met the impassable main logging road. A moment later, a heavy, vintage Ski-Doo Alpine, a twin-track, single-ski machine designed for deep, unbroken powder, burst through the snowdrifts, roaring toward their cabin. The rider was bundled in thick, brown canvas and wore a heavy fur trapper's hat pulled low over his goggles. Behind the snowmobile, he was towing a long, heavy-duty utility sled. Silas recognized the machine and the broad-shouldered posture of the rider immediately. It was Tobias Blake. Silas felt a strange knot tighten in his stomach. He looked at the long, empty sled Tobias was towing. In the deep backcountry, when a trapper came to check on isolated cabins after a 6-week polar vortex, an empty sled was usually brought for one grim purpose: to haul out the bodies. Tobias cut the engine near the front porch. The sudden silence was deafening. He dismounted slowly, pulling off his frost-covered goggles. His face was grim, heavily lined, his beard entirely encased in ice. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy steel pry bar and began trudging up the steps to the front porch. He was clearly preparing to break the door down, fully expecting the lock to be frozen solid and the occupants inside to be perfectly preserved in the icy tomb. Before Tobias could raise the pry bar, the front door swung open. Tobias staggered back a step, nearly slipping on the snowy porch. He dropped his hand, his jaw slackening in absolute shock. Standing in the doorway was Silas Abernathy. Silas was wearing a faded, short-sleeved t-shirt and thin denim jeans. He was barefoot. A sheen of sweat was visible on his collarbone, and a blast of hot, humid, 80-degree air billowed out of the cabin, carrying the distinct, sulphurous scent of a deep earth mine. "Morning, Tobias," Silas said casually, leaning against the doorframe. "A little brisk out there today." Tobias stared at Silas as if he were looking at a ghost. He blinked, looking from Silas's bare feet to the short sleeves, then back to the long, empty body sled he had parked in the yard. You're alive," Tobias rasped, his coarse voice barely a whisper. "The whole town. We thought. 40 below for 6 weeks. You didn't have any seasoned wood. Gideon swore you'd be dead by New Year's." "Gideon is a crook," Silas replied, his voice hardening slightly. "But he accidentally did us a massive favor. Come inside. Shut the door before you let the heat out." Tobias, moving in a state of bewildered compliance, stepped over the threshold. As Silas pulled the heavy door shut, Tobias stripped off his heavy fur hat and canvas coat, immediately overwhelmed by the sweltering heat. He looked around the cabin. It looked nothing like the neat, tidy home he had seen back in October. It looked like an industrial workshop. Heavy tarps covered the floors, laden with dark, wet, muddy logs in various stages of drying. And in the center of the room, the Fisher stove was radiating a heat so intense Tobias had to step back from it. "What in God's name are you burning?" Tobias asked, stepping closer to the brick hearth, where a neat stack of the fully cured, rock-hard black blocks sat waiting. Silas walked over, picked up a piece of the cured lignite, and tossed it to Tobias. The old trapper caught it clumsily, shocked by its sheer weight and its smooth, stone-like texture. He turned it over in his calloused hands, knocking his knuckles against it. "Clink. That's the swamp sponge," Silas said, crossing his arms. "The dead stone timber. The useless mudwood Gideon sold us for $300. Tobias looked from the black stone in his hand to the blazing white-hot core visible through the stove's glass pane. His eyes widened in realization. As a man who had spent his life in the mountains, he understood the geology of the region. He knew about the deep peat bogs. He just hadn't put the pieces together. No one ever had. "Lignite," Tobias whispered, looking at Silas with a profound, newfound respect. "It's low-grade coal. You're burning coal. We're force-curing it," Audrey said, stepping out from the kitchen area, handing Tobias a mug of hot black coffee. "It takes 3 days to bake the water out of the mud, but once it hardens, one block burns hotter and longer than 3 logs of dry pine." Tobias took the mug, his hand still trembling slightly from the shock. He looked out the window at the massive, snow-covered stacks of wood in the yard. 5 tons, Tobias muttered, shaking his head slowly, a deep, rumbling chuckle beginning to build in his chest. "You bought 5 tons of raw coal for $300. Gideon thought he was taking you for everything you had. Instead, he sold you enough high-yield fuel to heat this cabin for the next 5 winters." Tobias took a long sip of the hot coffee, his eyes twinkling with a sudden mischievous light. "You folks shouldn't have told me this," Tobias said, a broad, genuine smile finally breaking through his icy beard. "Because when Gideon Price finds out that the garbage he's been paying the logging company to haul away is actually worth its weight in gold, he's going to lose his absolute miserable mind." Silas and Audrey exchanged a glance. The survival phase was over. They had beaten the winter. But as Tobias set his mug down, Silas realized that a new problem was just beginning. Gideon Price was not a man who liked to lose, and he certainly wasn't a man who would let 5 tons of highly valuable fuel sit on a piece of property he still considered under his domain. The battle against the cold was won, but the battle for the monument was about to begin. The brutal grip of the polar vortex finally broke in late March. The transition from lethal winter to early spring in the Caribou Mountains was not a gentle awakening, but a violent, muddy upheaval. The massive snowdrifts that had entombed the Abernathy cabin began to collapse, sending torrents of freezing meltwater carving through the soil. The impassable logging road transformed into a treacherous, deeply rutted artery of thick brown clay. For Silas and Audrey, the sound of water dripping from the eaves was the sweetest music they had ever heard. They had survived. They were exhausted, their hands permanently calloused, their clothes smelling perpetually of deep earth and fire, but they were alive. As the sun returned, baking the muddy yard, they moved their operation outdoors. The interior of the cabin was finally scrubbed clean of the greasy black soot. Silas, utilizing the remnants of his contracting knowledge, constructed a massive, multi-tiered drying rack out of deadfall pine on the south-facing side of the property. They spent 2 weeks hauling the remaining heavy, wet logs of bogwood onto the racks, allowing the warming spring sun and the crisp mountain breezes to do the work the cast-iron stove had labored over all winter. Within a month, the racks were filled with thousands of hard, petrified black blocks. The 5 tons of swamp sponge had successfully completed its metamorphosis into dense, high-yield lignite. Tobias Blake became their first, albeit unofficial, customer. The old trapper rode down on his ATV in early May, tossing a 50-pound sack of venison onto their porch. In exchange, Silas loaded the back of Tobias's four-wheeler with 100 pounds of the cured black stone. "I tried a piece in my smokehouse last week," Tobias said, leaning against his machine and lighting a pipe. "Burns slower than hickory and hotter than oak. Gives the meat a heavy, rich flavor. You folks are sitting on a gold mine. You know that, right?" "We're just happy we didn't freeze," Audrey replied, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. "We're hoping we have enough to get through next winter without having to buy pine." Tobias chuckled, a raspy sound that rattled in his chest. "Next winter? You have enough here to heat half of Pine Ridge. And believe me, word is getting around. In a town this small, a secret like yours doesn't stay buried in the snow." Tobias was right. The local rumor mill was a highly efficient machine. Down in the valley, inside the smoky, dimly lit confines of the Pine Ridge Diner, loggers and off-grid locals swapped stories over burnt coffee and greasy eggs. The tale of the city couple who had survived 40 below zero burning wet mud had morphed into a local legend. Eventually, those whispers reached the dusty aisles of the local hardware store, straight to the ears of Gideon Price. Gideon was sitting behind his cluttered counter, reviewing a stack of unpaid invoices, when 2 local timber cruisers walked in, laughing about the Abernathy coal mine. Gideon stopped writing. He listened intently, as the men described the rock-hard black blocks Tobias Blake had been bragging about. A cold, sickening realization washed over Gideon. He hurried to his back office, pulling out his carbon copy ledger from October. He dragged his finger down the page until he found the entry. 30 cords. Salvage lot. Drained Valley Bog. $300. Gideon sank into his creaky leather chair, his face flushing with a mixture of profound embarrassment and boiling rage. He had spent 2 years staring at that massive, ugly pile of dredged timber sitting in the logging company's salvage yard. He had thought it was useless, waterlogged cellulose. He had practically given it away just to avoid paying the dumping fees to haul it to the municipal landfill. He hadn't sold them wet wood. He had sold them a massive, concentrated surface vein of raw lignite. Gideon grabbed a calculator. If dried and cured properly, high-yield coal alternatives sold for roughly $400 a ton in the backcountry. He had sold them roughly 50 tons of raw material, even accounting for water weight loss during curing. The Abernathys were sitting on $10,000 to $15,000 worth of premium, long-burning fuel, and he had handed it to them for $300. Gideon's pride, a fragile and vicious thing, could not handle the humiliation. He was the shrewd broker of Pine Ridge. He did not get bested by a pair of desperate, bankrupt city transplants. He looked back at the carbon copy of the receipt. A cunning, predatory smile slowly crept across his face. The receipt was vague. It was written hastily. It did not say firewood. It did not say coal. It said salvage timber lease, unclassified organic material. Gideon picked up his desk phone and dialed the number for a local heavy equipment rental yard. "Yeah, this is Gideon. I need a flatbed dump truck and a front-end loader for tomorrow morning, and tell the Miller brothers I have a day of heavy lifting for them. I've got some property to repossess. The morning of May 14th broke clear and warm, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Silas was underneath the porch, repairing a floor joist that had cracked under the extreme cold of the winter, when the ground began to vibrate. He slid out from under the decking, dusting off his jeans, and looked down the long, muddy driveway. A heavy yellow front-end loader was rumbling up the grade, its massive diesel engine bellowing smoke into the pristine air. Directly behind it was a 10-ton flatbed dump truck. Audrey stepped out of the cabin, a dish towel in her hands, her face pale. "Silas? Did you order gravel?" "No," Silas said, his posture stiffening as the vehicles breached the tree line and pulled into their yard. The front-end loader parked directly in front of the massive, meticulously stacked drying racks holding thousands of pieces of cured lignite. The engine idled loudly. The door of the dump truck opened, and Gideon Price stepped out. He was flanked by two massive, heavily bearded men in denim workshirts. The Miller brothers, known locally as hired muscle for anyone willing to pay them in cash and cheap beer. Gideon adjusted his baseball cap, a smug, authoritative look plastered across his face. He walked toward the porch, completely ignoring the fact that he was trespassing on private land. "Morning, Silas." Audrey, Gideon, called out over the rumble of the diesel engines. "Glad to see you folks thawed out all right." Silas stepped off the porch, placing himself firmly between Gideon and the drying racks. "What is this, Gideon? You're tearing up my driveway." Gideon pulled a folded piece of yellow carbon paper from his chest pocket. He flicked it open with a dramatic snap. "Just correcting a little clerical error from the fall, Silas. I'm here to collect my property." "Your property?" Silas's voice was dangerously calm. "We paid you $300 for that wood. We have a bill of sale." "You have a receipt for a salvage lease," Gideon corrected, taking a step closer, trying to use his height to intimidate Silas. "And more importantly, the contract explicitly pertained to timber, wood, cellulose. I have it on very good authority from the Provincial Geological Survey that the material I dropped off here is classified as low-grade lignite. That's a mineral, Silas. A geological asset. You can't sell mineral rights on a handwritten hardware store receipt. The sale is legally void." Audrey stepped down to stand beside Silas. "You told us it was firewood. You lied to us to get our money, and now that we did the backbreaking work of curing it, you want to steal it back?" "I'm not stealing anything, little lady," Gideon sneered, gesturing to the Miller brothers. "I'm refunding your $300, plus $50 for your labor. But this coal belongs to the Pine Ridge Salvage Company. Boys, fire up the loader. Let's get this rock in the truck." One of the Miller brothers cracked his knuckles and turned toward the yellow machine. "Stop right there," Silas commanded, his voice suddenly echoing with the booming authority of a man who used to run crews of 30 construction workers on high-rise sites. The brother paused, looking back at Gideon. Silas didn't yell. He didn't threaten them with violence. He simply walked toward Gideon, closing the distance until they were inches apart. The fear that had paralyzed Silas during the winter was gone, burned away by the white-hot heat of the stone they had tamed. "You want to play the legal classification game, Gideon?" Silas asked quietly, his eyes locked onto the brokers. "Let's play it." Silas pointed a calloused, soot-stained finger at the massive racks of black stone. "If that is classified as a geological asset and a mineral," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engines, "then you did not deliver firewood to a residential property. You excavated, transported, and dumped 50 tons of unrefined, unpermitted mining material onto private land." Gideon's smug smile faltered slightly. "It's a technicality. It's a federal environmental crime," Silas corrected sharply. "I was a commercial contractor for 15 years, Gideon. I know the laws regarding wetland dredging and mineral extraction. British Columbia requires a Category 3 Crownland mineral lease to extract coal, even low-grade lignite. Furthermore, transporting raw, untreated bog spoil across county lines without a hazardous materials manifesto carries a fine of $10,000 per ton." The color began to drain from Gideon's face. The Miller brothers exchanged a nervous glance. They were hired to intimidate city folk, not get wrapped up in federal environmental investigations. "You're bluffing," Gideon spat, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "You don't have the money for a lawyer." Audrey pulled her smartphone from her pocket. She held it up, tapping the screen. "I don't need a lawyer to dial the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. I have photos of your truck dumping it, Gideon. I have the receipt proving you transported it. If you claim this is coal, you are admitting to operating an illegal, unpermitted strip mine. The Crown will seize your hardware store just to pay the preliminary fines." Silas took a final step forward, towering slightly over the retreating broker. "So, let's decide right now, Gideon. Did you sell me 30 cords of ugly, useless firewood for $300? Or did you illegally dump 50 tons of toxic mineral waste on my property?" The silence that stretched between them was heavier than the lignite sitting on the racks. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the front-end loader's engine. Gideon looked at Silas, then at the phone in Audrey's hand, and finally at the massive fortune in black stone sitting just out of his reach. He was trapped, utterly outmaneuvered by the very technicality he had tried to exploit. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. It's firewood," Gideon choked out, his face a mask of bitter defeat. "Ugly, useless firewood." "That's what I thought," Silas said, stepping back. "Now get your machinery off my property before I charge you for destroying my driveway." Gideon didn't say another word. He spun on his heel, marching back to the dump truck. He barked an order at the Miller brothers, who looked visibly relieved as they climbed back into their vehicles. The heavy machinery reversed, churning up the mud, and retreated down the logging road, leaving a plume of dirty exhaust in their wake. Audrey let out a long, shaky breath, leaning against Silas. Silas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, looking at the thousands of cured black stones resting in the spring sun. They hadn't just survived the winter. They had defended their sanctuary. The summer that faggot Silas. In summer. The followed was a season of relentless focused industry. The victory over Gideon Price had catalyzed something deep within Silas and Audrey. They were no longer refugees hiding in the woods from their past failures. They were pioneers who had discovered a hidden vein of life. With the threat of repossession gone, they fully committed to their new reality. They didn't just want to survive the next winter. They wanted to thrive. Using the last of their meager funds and a small zero-interest loan from a surprisingly eager Tobias Blake, Silas purchased cinder blocks, fire brick, and heavy steel grating. Drawing on his architectural knowledge, he designed and constructed a professional-grade, passive solar and wood-fired kiln in the clearing behind the cabin. It was a masterpiece of off-grid engineering. The structure utilized the intense summer sun to pre-bake the moisture out of the remaining raw bogwood, while a small, highly efficient firebox, fueled by local deadfall, provided the intense, sustained heat required to compress the carbon and petrify the logs. What had taken them 3 agonizing days of labor inside the freezing cabin could now be accomplished in 24 hours in the new kiln, producing hundreds of pounds of perfectly cured, rock-hard lignite at a time. By August, their property had been transformed. The ugly, sprawling mud piles were gone, replaced by neat, meticulously organized pallets of heavy, black stone. They purchased a heavy-duty shrink-wrap machine and heavy mill plastic bags. They branded it simply Caribou Stone Coal, the 100-hour burn. In September, just as the first chill of autumn returned to the mountain air, Silas loaded 50 bags of the cured lignite into the back of his Ford pickup. He didn't drive to Pine Ridge. He bypassed Gideon's territory entirely, driving 80 miles south to the larger logging hub of Williams Lake. He set up a small demonstration in the parking lot of the regional farmers market. He brought a small cast-iron stove, loaded it with just 3 pieces of the black stone, and lit it. For 10 hours, the stove radiated a blistering, white-hot heat without needing a single piece of additional fuel. The off-grid community, weary of spending thousands of dollars every winter on fast-burning cordwood, was captivated. By the end of the day, Silas had sold all 50 bags at $20 apiece. By the end of the week, he had a wait list of 40 customers begging for delivery. The financial turnaround was rapid and staggering. The $300 investment that was supposed to kill them had become a thriving, lucrative enterprise. They were making enough money to repair the cabin, upgrade their vehicles, and finally build a substantial savings account. As November approached, painting the mountains in stark whites and grays, Silas and Audrey sat on their rebuilt front porch, sipping hot coffee. The air was biting, a precursor to the deep freeze that would soon blanket the world. Down the road, a truck pulled up. It was Tobias, coming to pick up his winter supply. He waved, his face breaking into a wide, familiar grin. Silas waved back, feeling a profound sense of peace. He looked at Audrey, whose face was healthy, strong, and deeply content. They had arrived in these mountains broken, terrified, and at the mercy of a harsh, unforgiving world. But they had learned the most vital lesson of the wilderness. Survival was not about fighting the environment. It was about understanding it. They had taken the ugliest, most reviled element of the forest, the very mud beneath their feet, and through sheer will, pressure, and fire, they had turned it into their salvation. The winter was coming, but for the first time in their lives, they were not afraid of the cold. They had the fire of the ancient earth burning in their hearth. In the end, the Caribou Mountains did not care about Silas and Audrey's empty bank accounts, their past failures in the city, or the deceit of men like Gideon Price. The wilderness only responded to resilience and adaptation. The very timber that was meant to be their frozen tomb had secretly harbored the ancient, concentrated power of the earth, waiting only for the right catalyst to awaken. Their journey from desperate isolation to building a thriving livelihood proved that survival is rarely about what you are given. It is almost entirely about what you are willing to endure to transform it. The swamp sponge that everyone mocked had become the unbreakable foundation of their new lives. They had faced the absolute zero of despair and forged their own heat, proving that sometimes the most profound salvation is buried in the darkest, most unexpected dirt, just waiting for the fire to catch.